कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Hello and welcome to a new edition of Kitabnama Books and Beyond. Today I have with me the writer Alberto Manguel.
I am delighted, thank you.
Alberto, I think it means a lot to Indian readers to be able to hear you, because as readers, typically you tend to have a very deferential relationship to writers, and in your work there is a kind of passage allowed to us readers to learn about our own power in your book, A History of Reading. So would you like to tell us a little bit about the power that the reader has in literature?
If literature descends from the writer to the reader, it is the reader who, with a little cup, catches the drops that he wants or she wants to catch. So what is retained of that huge flow of literature is only what the reader chooses. And some 20 years ago, I realized that I was much more a reader than a writer and wanted to find out more about myself. So I began to ask questions about reading and what it meant, and in fact how to define it. So I went through the characteristics of what I do and found that we have a hidden power. We readers have the power of defining a literary text, saying, for instance, if Gulliver's Travels is a fierce satire or whether it's a book for children. We also have the power of deciding what will remain, what will be a classic, and what will be forgotten. And nothing that the writer can do, even if the writer went out into the crowd and paid everyone to say that the book should be remembered, eventually readers decide according to their tastes. And our libraries are a witness not to the power of the writer, but to the power of the reader.
Often as writers, we sometimes hold, whether publicly or privately, a very dim view of other people's writing. Is it also the same in the world of readers, that as readers we hold some other kinds of reading to be inferior? And what does that mean for us?
I think that readers grant a book a kind of immortality. The writer dies with the last full stop. When the writer finishes his or her work, the writer ceases to exist, and the book remains in a limbo, in an inanimate state, until the reader breathes life into it. There is an old Latin tag that says, verba volant scripta manent, which means, and was always taken to mean, that what is written remains, what is spoken disappears in the air. But it can be interpreted differently. It can be interpreted that what is written is buried on the page, and that what is spoken, what is read, acquires wings and flies.
Alberto, it occurs to me that often as writers, we sometimes hold, whether publicly or privately, a very dim view of other people's writing. Is it also the same in the world of readers, that as readers we hold some other kinds of reading to be inferior? And what does that mean for us?
I think that reading can provoke a kind of addiction you fall in love with a certain book, and then you begin to look for the works of the writer, and no matter what it is, you want to like it. So readers can be afflicted by non-judgmental reading. They can be driven simply by what they think they like. But usually the case is that we can be very trenchant and say, of Henry James, I like Wings of the Dove, The Golden Bowl, The Spoils of Poynton, but I don't like a story with the worst title in the world, Crappy Cordelia.
One of your books is called The Library at Night, and I wonder if you wanted to expand on two related ideas. One, that reading is something that's most powerful, most romantic when done in the hours of dark. And the other, that also that reading is something you do after hours, that after you do your work for the day, nighttime is when you come home to read.
I think reading varies according to the place we're in and according to the time of day. There are three elements that form part of the act of reading: the reader, the book of course, but also the space in which we read. Keats called that an amorous space, a space where the book and you make love, which is not as far-fetched a metaphor as you might think, because we speak of taking a book to bed, and in French you say jouir de la lecture, which means to reach orgasm in reading. But reading at night, and especially reading in your library at night, surrounded by your books, produces a curious effect. During the day in my library, the order of the shelves are visible, and so they are imposed on me. At night, because I turn the lights off and I just have my reading light, the concentration is on the text, and it produces, I'm not going to go all mystical here, but a kind of magic. I feel the ghosts rising out from the book and taking over.
Very often in talks about literature today, we also tend to end up talking about the place of the book as a physical object. And I remember once another writer I met said to me in her not very good English, the book is a genius medium, which I thought was a very striking idea, that there's something much more durable about the book and that it cannot be easily supplanted in literature by other technological forms that have come after it.
There are two ways to answer your question. On the one hand, I would say that in this history of humankind, we have invented a few perfect things. The wheel. You cannot perfect the wheel. You cannot make a square wheel that works better than a round wheel. The knife, which appears in every civilization and can have a beneficial or a noxious use. And the codex, this thing is perfect because it allows you to capture the memory of your experience in writing. It allows you to carry it with you. It allows you to communicate by writing on the margins. And it allows you the freedom of opening it on any page, going back, going forward, giving it the time and the rhythm that you want for the reading. So it's a perfect object. The second way in which I would answer your question is that every time a new technology appears, it decrees the death of the previous technology and takes over some of its vocabulary. So when photography was invented, it was said painting is dead, and photography took over the language of painting with still lives and portraiture and landscapes. But eventually what happens is that both technologies, new and old, feed on one another. And so photography transformed the painting, and painting affected photography. It became more creative. I think that the print media and the electronic media have affected one another, but mainly in one direction. Electronic media, because it wasn't an intellectual invention, it was a commercial invention, and above all commercial usage, tried to take from print all aspects. So it wants to look like a book. The Kindle is covered in leather. The gesture you do is the gesture of turning a page. So the imitation is meant to curb the nostalgia for the previous technology. I am waiting for the moment when the electronic technology will renew and influence print, when something will come up that is a new form that benefits from the marvelous richness of the new technology.
Does the word read have different connotations in other languages, the exact corresponding word? Because in English it seems to mean both to absorb with your eyes but also to speak aloud.
Yes. I think in the languages that I know, it has both those connotations. But you can, of course, in many languages, perhaps in all, you can extend the meaning of read from reading words to reading your surroundings, reading gestures. I think that we can define ourselves as reading animals, because we come into the world with the impulse of recognizing stories in our surroundings, in everything that is in the world, stories that, of course, we create. So at the same time, we lend meaning to the world and read that meaning. So the word reading should be extended to much more than grasping the sense of a written text.
One very memorable encounter you had with another reader was the great Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, and more than once in your work you speak about your encounters as a teenager in Buenos Aires with this man who read at that time with his ears and with his voice, not with his eyes.
I spent my adolescence in Buenos Aires, and after school I used to work in a bookstore, and Jorge Luis Borges used to come to buy his books there. But he had become blind some 10 years earlier. We're talking about the 60s. And so he needed people to read to him the text that he was interested in. And so one day, I was 14 years old, he said to me, if you're free in the evening, would you like to come and read to me? And I read to him in English, in French, in Spanish, texts that Borges wanted to recapture because he was trying to write prose again. When he became blind, he said that he would continue to write poetry because it came to him as a music to which he added words and then could dictate. But that for writing prose, he needed to see his hand write. But a few years later, he had so many stories that he had imagined that he felt the need to write prose again. But before that, he wanted to see how the stories of the great masters for him, Kipling, Stevenson, Henry James, and so on, had done their work. So he would ask me to read a specific text, but interrupt after one or two lines and to make a comment, but they were the comments of a craftsman, to say how a word was used, how a sentence was concluded, how suspense was created. He would say marvelous things such as, a writer should always make the reader believe that he's more intelligent than the writer.
When we think about the history of the book, I wonder if, when we trace the social history of the book, I wonder if there's a certain point when books from being very rare objects began to be mass produced, and I'm trying to think of when in history they became the sorts of things that people put in their living rooms as an expression of who they were, and what it means for the future if books were to retreat from our libraries. I know in so many houses in India today, it's the television set and not the book that is at the center of the living room.
That's very true, but it's a very, very ancient impulse to consider the book, and in the case of Samaria, perhaps the stone stels, rather as objects rather than as containers of text. And so we have fabulous manuscripts in the Middle Ages that were used far less to read than as a token of the richness and power of the possessor. But you mentioned the relationship to the book in India. Salman Rushdie tells a story that in his house books were very sacred objects. And so, of course, if the Quran fell to the floor, it would be picked up reverentially and kissed. But any book, even the phone book, if it fell down to the floor, he would be picked up and kissed.
I wonder if in your mind there is a useful distinction to be made between the hardback and the paperback, and perhaps as writers we tend to be slightly snobbish and make up a library of hardbacks and give it a greater dignity. But there's something surely that the paperback did in the history of literature, which was to encourage the democratization of literature, to make good literature available at cheap prices to the masses. And if paperbacks have any place in your own library?
It is not that nobody thought about the paperback or the pocketbook before. In Venice, Aldus Manutius, the great printer, produced a series of exquisite small books, not paperbacks because they were hardbound, but to be carried in the pocket, which would facilitate access to the classics for everyone. We have a wonderful list of the prostitutes of Venice, stating for each their qualities, and one says Lola on the street by the Grand Canal, she has a series of paperbacks or pocketbooks of the great classics, and she can talk about them. So, but when the paperback came into its own as a pocketbook, with Penguin especially, the reaction of the intellectuals was very mixed. George Orwell, who was of course such an extraordinary liberal thinker, opposed the paperback because he thought that it would denigrate the prestige of the text. I must say that in my case, while I prefer hardbacks always, and in my library I have mainly hardbacks, when I travel, the hardbacks are too cumbersome, so I carry with me paperbacks. The problem is that if I read a book for the first time in a paperback edition, that edition becomes the editio princeps, the first edition for me.
Do you also think there's a distinction to be made between books bought first-hand and those bought second-hand?
I like books bought second-hand because they carry a history with them. I like to find that remote friend on the margins of a book who has scribbled a note with which I agree or disagree. I like to find mementos in second-hand books, old tickets, pressed flowers. They seem to me messages in a bottle launched into the sea of libraries that I have been privileged enough to rescue. And sometimes you find such marvelous surprises. The American poet Marianne Moore did a translation of the fables of La Fontaine, and I found in Paris an edition of her translation annotated in her hand with corrections for the publisher for the following edition.
Alberto, I also wanted to ask you about your book Stevenson Under the Palm Trees. This writer, the Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson is clearly a subject of importance, not just to Borges, whom you spent so much time with when you were younger, but to you so much so that you wrote an entire novel about him.
Stevenson is one of my favorite writers, both as a stylist and as an inventor of stories, and also as a man. I wish I had met him because he was one of those very rare creatures in the world of literature, a good, honest, ethical man. One of my publishers asked me if I would contribute to a series of detective stories, and I thought long and hard about it, and I invented a story with Stevenson as the protagonist. Stevenson in his last days when he lived in Samoa, where he died.
Something that a lot of people, including very close, attentive readers of yours, don't know, that you have not only written a short book on Kipling, but also a play about him. And Kipling is a controversial figure in India, and I'm not sure that a lot of Indian readers read him anymore. And they tend to think he was a British or imperialist writer. But I know that you have a different view on that, and you think he's very much a necessary part of the Indian canon. Would you like to explain why?
I wouldn't say should, because I consider it impertinent to tell someone what they should read. But I have recommended the book to Indian friends who hadn't read it for that reason, because they thought here is an imperialist writer, and who were overwhelmed by his writing. Rohinton Mistry, who is a friend, hadn't read Kipling's Kim, and after he finished it, he said, "This is the great Indian novel."
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you for being with us today on Kitabnama, Books and Beyond.
This is a reading from my book, Helen of Troy, Goddess, Princess, Whore, where I try to find the reality of the mythical figure Helen. Was she a real princess in ancient Greece around 3,500 years ago? Was she a goddess, a sublime figure, or was she a bad girl as she's been described through history? This is one of the early chapters when I look at the possibilities of a Bronze Age, of an ancient Helen, a prehistoric princess. Life for our Bronze Age Helen would have been sensuous and short. The average age of death for Mycenaean females was 28. Women were mothers at 12, grandmothers at 24, dead before they were 30. The majority of the population was carried off in its prime by disease. Homer talks about the scurf of age, but in real terms, in prehistoric Greece, this was a land populated by the very young, and it had a cultural energy to match. Archaeological finds attest to trade in gold, silver, amber, carnelian, obsidian, red jasper, lapis lazuli, and ivory from both elephants and hippopotamuses. In Pithoi, giant storage jars, there are traces of olive oil, frankincense, myrrh and wine. Coriander and sesame were used to flavour food, rose petals, sage and anise to sweeten perfumes. The clothes of the richest Greeks, made of wool and linen and even fine wild silk, were coloured with saffron and a purple dye extracted from a species of sea snail. You could say the Mycenaeans were a magpie culture. Great sea journeys would be undertaken to bring the finest raw materials and manufactured goods back to the Greek mainland. The more successful a clan leader was, the more his palace would have glittered. Storerooms and tombs would have been stacked with relucent treasure. Cult images were dressed in a cloth that had been impregnated with olive oil to give the material a distinctive sheen, and privileged mortals too would have worn their clothes treated in this way. Those of the highest rank are, for the first time, literally illustrious. Perhaps this is what the bards meant when they recalled that Helen was radiant, fair, shimmering and golden. The finds from the Mycenaean citadels and graves illustrate the centrality of visual signs in prehistory. Before writing was employed as a tool of propaganda, appearance and experience are all important. Images have to speak louder than words. The ruling classes of the Mycenaeans had access to precious raw materials from across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, of a calibre and a variety never imagined before. We have to think of Helen walking through these palaces, dripping in gold, her skin gleaming like honey, the smell of olive oil on her clothes, sweet perfumes in her hair. In marked contrast to the rest of the population, the high-born made sure that they gleamed perpetually with an artificial lustre. So a girl like Helen, sparkling and glinting as she would have done, would have had it reinforced day in and day out from a very early age just how important, how valuable and how desirable she was.